Okay, welcome to lesson 2 in the Russian Revolution course revision guide. So, what we're looking at today? Well, we've got a revolution for you. Yeah, you started studying the Russian Revolution expecting revolutions. Well, today's your day. We've got you one, all right? There are 3 revolutions in this course, 3 revolutions in the Russian Revolution, and 2 of those happened in 1917. The first one happens here in 1905. So let's get going. First of all, though, what is a revolution? Okay, revolution means change. Okay, you could have a technological revolution. You could have a revolution in how you play the game of football. You can have a revolution in politics and in a political system. It's about, as far as we're concerned, talking about a political change, which is what this is. It's a change in the way that a government is run. Not a change of government. For example, a democracy changes government quite often. That's not a revolution. A revolution would be if you got rid of democracy entirely and replaced it with something new, a different way of governing a country. So given that description, is the 1905 a real revolution? Sort of not, because at the beginning of it, the Tsar's in charge, and at the end of it, the Tsar's in charge. So you could look at this as a failed revolution, as a revolution that promised but failed to deliver on those promises. So let's have a quick look. Causes, events, consequences, classic history teacher stuff. Let's have a look then. Causes. First one, Russia-Japanese War. This is going to sound a bit strange, I like this war. I like the story and what it meant of this war. Essentially, Russia fights Japan and Japan wins, which is very embarrassing to Russia. And it made people look at the Tsar like he was a bit of an idiot, right? That's the gist. That's the overview. Russia fights Japan, Japan wins. The Tsar looked like a plonker. But there's far more to it than that, because it's important for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, you need to understand the Russian mindset. They considered themselves one of the big boys of Europe. Britain and France, and increasingly Germany before the war, had their empires. The Austrian-Hungarians have got an empire. The Ottomans down in Turkey had an empire. And the Russians had an empire. They had the Baltic states, they had Ukraine, they had Poland, and they considered themselves an imperial power, European, powerful, modern, not to be messed with. Certainly not to be messed with by, this is going to sound a bit funny, but hear me out, by an Asian country. Okay, they saw Japan as a third world Asian nation, the sort of nation that Britain, France, and Germany had been pushing around and bullying for the last 200 years. And they thought, well, if they can do it, we can do it. So they got themselves into this fight with Japan. But they picked the wrong Asians to mix with on this particular occasion, because the Japanese had just spent the last 30 years modernizing their country. They had got, and it's a fascinating story, and you can check out the Japanese history course for this one. But they basically got sick and tired of losing to the West, to Europe, to America, and they decided to do something about it. And they had their own revolution, and they sent out advisors around Europe, around America, and they stole all the best ideas they could. They took ideas from Germany, they took ideas from France, they took ideas from Britain, and they combined them all into one and added in their own special Japanese spice and created a very modern, very powerful economy in the Pacific, in Asia, which allowed them to build their own empire, which was humongous and lasted right up until basically the Americans dropped an A-bomb on their heads. And these were the people that Russia was mixing with, about to fight with, and Russia was not expecting it. Was not expecting to get taught a lesson in how to fight modern wars, but they were. So start off with the Japanese sink the Russian Pacific fleet. Their navy ships are sunk, defeated, captured, and Russia is shocked. How could this happen? And they try to justify it. They said to themselves, well, hang on, this is just because it's our Pacific fleet. The real bad boys of the fleet, the best ships, the best sailors, they're in the Baltic, because we keep them there if there's ever going to be a war with Germany or a war with Britain or a war with France. If we've got to actually fight proper people, as the sort of imperialist Europeans would have thought it. But they thought, right, let's go teach them a lesson. Let's go send our proper fleet round to Japan to teach them a lesson and get revenge. And they do that. They sail their Baltic fleet all the way around the Arctic Circle, around Russia, down to Japan, and they all get sunk. There's a great book called The Fleet That Had to Die. I think that's what it's called. Read that when I was younger, and really good book. I should probably reread it sometimes now. It probably mean more to me now than it did at the time. About that, the story of that fleet as it sailed around and never ultimately got sunk by the Japanese. So this is very embarrassing, and the Tsar gets the flack. The Russian people look at him and say, how could you do this to us? Look what it now looks like. Yeah, all the other Europeans are laughing at us. It dents their pride to have been the first European nation to have lost to an Asian nation. Okay? Sounds funny to say it out loud, but this is how it was viewed at the time. Right, whilst that was going on, you still had Russia, which was starting to industrialize, and the conditions in the cities were very, very poor, and you've got this thing result called Bloody Sunday. The factory workers were out on the streets protesting. They demanded better pay and conditions, and the Tsar's soldiers shot them all dead. Well, not all, but shot a good number of them dead. And all they were trying to do is hand in a petition to ask for better pay and conditions. As you can imagine, this goes down very, very badly, and the Tsar is blamed further. This looks pretty bad. So this sparks the 1905 revolution. What happens? There's three major events we need to talk about. I'm actually going to start talking about point number 2 first. Okay, I'll come back to point number 1 in a minute. Point number 2, I'll try and make it brief. The peasants were not happy. Okay, the peasants were probably the worst treated bunch of farmers anywhere in Europe at that time. Historically, Russia was behind the rest of Europe. Their farmers, the people that worked the land, were still treated more or less like medieval peasants. They had tried to change this a little bit. They used to have a system of serfdom, and they'd kind of got rid of that, but it was still hanging around a little bit, and the peasants weren't treated very well. So they weren't very happy, and they decided to take matters into their own hands. And like all good revolutionary peasants, they start off by kicking their landlord out of his big house and burning it to the ground and stealing all the gold that was in it first. So they do all that, and they create these things called communes, where they take all the land that they've stolen, basically, from the rich, and they divide it up amongst themselves, and they begin to run. Big parts of Russia are now run by these workers' communes that have taken over power from the old landlords. Very embarrassing for the Tsar, obviously, because he's losing control of his own country. And they're quickly shut down by the police. Point number 3, we're going to start off with, then we'll go back to number 1. Number 3, the St. Petersburg Soviet. Now, this is very important. 1905, St. Petersburg the city is still called St. Petersburg. It's renamed Petrograd at the beginning of the First World War, because they don't want it to sound, they think Petersburg sounds too German, and they're fighting the Germans, so they make it sound more Rusky and call it Petrograd. So anyway, the St. Petersburg Soviet. Right, what does the word Soviet mean? This is going to become very, very important in this course. The word Soviet means council in Russian. A council, a council. A group of men and women sitting around a table deciding what things should be done. That's a council, right? A Soviet, Soviet is council. A Soviet is created in St. Petersburg. On that council, on that Soviet, were workers who worked in the factories. And they, just like the peasants with their communes taking over parts of the countryside, they took over parts of the city and ran it the way they saw fit. They kicked out the police, they kicked out the army, and they had their own Soviets run different parts of the city. Again, very embarrassing for the Tsar, and again, it is quickly closed down. But it's very important that it existed, because this is 1905. In 1917, the St. Petersburg Soviet, which is then called the Petrograd Soviet because of the change in the name, is incredibly important. And so they this is like a dry run. This is like the Petrograd Soviet version 1, and you get version 2 and version 3 later in 1917. So it's a good practice run for the revolutionaries, this, and it gives people the idea that they could do it again. And number 1, probably the more standouty, interesting points of this revolution, the Potemkin mutiny. Okay, it's good fun to say that word, Potemkin. I could be saying it wrong, I don't think so, but Potemkin. Right, the Russian Navy battleship Potemkin had a mutiny. What is a mutiny? Well, it is one of our key words in today's lesson. Look at that, mutiny. It's when people in the military, whether that be the Army, Navy, or Air Force, refuse to follow orders and do their own thing. And that's what happens. These sailors on board the Russian battleship Potemkin refuse to follow orders. In fact, they don't just refuse to follow orders, they shoot their officers. Ha! Serves them right. And they take over the ship, and then they sail to Odessa, which is in Crimea, or just near Crimea. And they join the protesters against the Tsar. Okay, so the battleship sails into the city, stops, parks up, the sailors get out. They're on the streets protesting with everyone else, with the factory workers, in their sailors' uniforms, showing that even the Tsar can't even control his own navy. The army rock up, who are loyal to the Tsar, and start quickly arresting people, and the sailors do what all good sailors do, and they run away at the first sight of the police. So they run away and they jump back into their battleship, and then they sail away to Romania, where they are basically looking for protection and safety. And when they get there, they leave the ship, they go live in Romania, but just for good measure, they sink their own battleship. Okay, the word is scuttle, which is another good word. Potemkin was scuttled. Okay, scuttle is when you sink your own ship. Google the word Harwich, U-boat scuttle. That's a good story as well. Right. Okay. We get sidetracked. Moving on. Consequences. October Manifesto, Tsar Nicholas II. Right. So how does he get himself out of this mess? Well, obviously the army and the police remain loyal to him, which is incredibly important. And it doesn't happen later in 1917. So this time the police and the army are loyal, and he is able to introduce reforms. This is how he gets out of it. He promises to change. Okay? It's like a giant fight with his girlfriend. He said, I promise I'll be a new man. Take me back. I'll be a new man. And these are the promises he gives. He says, I will introduce a parliament, which in Russia they call it Duma. I will give you more freedoms of speech and the right to join trade unions, and I will give you all better wages. And this sounds fantastic to the people protesting, and they say, yes, we have achieved our aim. We've got a Duma. We're going to start to slowly become a modern European-style democracy like Britain or France, maybe even a constitutional monarchy, which is where you still have the Tsar, but underneath him you have a proper democracy, a little bit like Britain, where you've got the Queen, but underneath that you've got a proper democracy, proper-ish democracy going on. And that's what they are hoping that they're going to get. But it was a lie. Because as soon as the revolution stops, the repression starts. Okay, repression is being nasty to people, right? And that's what happens. The Tsar appoints a prime minister, a guy called Peter Stolypin. And he's not a very nice man. And he quickly goes around, he locks up all the people that were involved in the protests. He shuts down all the newspapers and generally is unpleasant to everybody. He sends the army out into the countryside. He finds the people that were in charge of the communes and kills them. So he kind of puts a stop to the revolution there. But this is still a very important point in the story of the Russian Revolution, because it gave people the idea, it gave people a glimpse of what could be. It was a practice run for people getting out on the streets, for the Navy starting to mutiny. All these things that do eventually happen are kind of practiced here. This is like the dress rehearsal for the real thing. And one of the biggest consequences of this, though, obviously, the extra to this is the sense of betrayal that people now feel. So when the real one comes in 1917, all those things they were unhappy about are still there, but now you have that extra dollop of betrayal, because the Tsar promised a Duma, he promises free speech, he promises freedom to join trade unions and better pay and conditions, and he lied. So you're even more, if you weren't angry before, you're definitely angry with him now. So that is why the 1905 revolution is important. Okay, have a go at the two questions at the bottom there, and there is a matchup keyword activity on the next slide. Okay, see you next time in Russian Revolution history.